Another part of your framework is trying to outguess markets. And so when I think about extrapolating recent returns and we're talking about individual stocks, I also have a lot of people who don't want anything to do with international anymore. And some of that's because US markets have been absolutely dominating since the great financial crisis. But that feels a lot like trying to outguess what is going to move next. How do you think about that? What are some other examples that you can give as people are thinking through different fads or different ideas to identify, oh, wait, maybe I am trying to outsmart things?
Yeah, absolutely. So whether it's focusing on past returns or having some sort of prediction based on information that everybody knows. Like we all are, reading, if I'll just give you an example. Maybe we're going to see a huge boon in economic productivity and efficiency due to AI. Okay, that's great. We all know it. But does that mean you should pile into AI stocks? Or just because the U.S. has done well, should we focus our portfolios just on U.S. stocks? I think that anything that's pushing you to less diversification is you really have to look at that as, okay, but diversification is the only free lunch out there. So what is the framework that would cause me to really want to abandon diversification and focus on a narrower set of stocks? And time again, I would say that there's really not a great reason to do that. Just because the U.S. has been, honestly, they have been on a tear now for quite some time. There's nothing to think that always has to be the case. If you really pushed me on it, I would say I think that the U.S. has similar expected returns on a go forward as most other developed countries. And of course, we have to go back further and further. But there have been long periods of time where the U.S. has underperformed markets outside of the U.S., right? So the decade after the turn of the century was an entire 10-year period where the S&P had negative returns. If we were talking about the names that we are always talking about today, right? The NASDAQ 100, so the biggest names, which have been doing really well lately in the U.S., they did even more poorly during that last decade. So without knowing where the returns are going to show up, I think it makes the most sense for people to just hold a globally diversified portfolio. And again, when we talk about like not extrapolating past returns, but then also considering prices give us the most information. Today's prices give us the most information about future expected returns. Where the U.S. valuations sit today, we really have only seen once in the past, and that was kind of during the dot-com run-up and then bust. I can't tell you, well, there's a reliably statistical relationship there between aggregate valuation ratios and future equity returns, but part of that is because when you only have one instance in time, it's an anecdote. You don't get to do research when you only have one observation. But in my heart of hearts, I do think that prices tell us something about expected returns. And if anything, the prices are telling us, hey, now's the moment. You really actually do want global diversification. You always want global diversification, but I can come with a few different reasons why today is a really good time for global diversification. Part of it has to do with the valuations that we're seeing in the U.S. Part of it also is just concentration we're seeing in the U.S. So these days, over a third of the S&P 500 is in the top 10 names. That's been creeping up over time as, the Mag 7s have been doing really well. And just to give you some perspective on how big the Mag 7 represents of the total market portfolio, if you add up the weight in the Mag 7 names in like a globally diversified portfolio, its weight is now pretty similar to the next biggest 7 non-US countries combined. 7 stocks, 7 countries, not the little ones, the biggest ones.
Yeah.
And it's just giving you some idea of just how, and a lot of that is because of their prices, not their economic footprint. right? If you add up the earnings footprint of these companies versus the next 7 countries, their earnings footprint is much smaller. So how are they getting to that outsized weight in the global portfolio? It is through having pretty high valuations. To me, that's a reason why you probably want to have, pull away a bit through things like global diversification, through things like size value tilts, are ways that you can kind of reduce weight in some very expensive names.